11 o'clock at night. So good night to you guys. I am switching format to kind of a not really a podcast per se, but a show. So those of you guys who are on the East Coast, um, you may get to see the premiere at an earlier time of day. But it does also mean that your ability to ask me questions during the live is going to be diminished, if not eliminated. So there's that. So this might be the last week that you guys get direct access to me and are able to ask me questions directly. All right. So let's talk about passport portfolios. I believe that's what we were set up to do today. Let me go ahead and get my personal over here on the TikTok side while we get into that. So, typically, the number one passport that you get is one that you may or may not know that you have, uh, and it's typically a bloodline passport, right? And so with the bloodline passport, it means typically doesn't go much further than your grandparents. Not every country even allows grandparents, but typically there's a family member that, by way of that family member, you may have a claim. It's almost like by right, citizenship by right almost. You may have a claim to that citizenship from that place, right? So a lot of Caribbean islands do that, all right? So a lot of people who have Caribbean descent, we can get them a passport from that Caribbean island as long as it's not too far away. We had somebody who popped up and it was like their great great grandmother. That ain't gonna work, right? But if it's your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa, that could work. There are some countries that only really focus on mom because their mentality around it is your mother could have slept with anybody, but you definitely came out of your mother. So they don't necessarily care who dad is, especially if dad is already passed. If a DNA test can be done, then in this day and age, typically countries will accept them. But there are some countries that, by the letter of the law, they are only looking at who your mother is because essentially that's all they can prove to be true, versus whoever is the father on your birth certificate. So that is one methodology. That's typically the primary passport in a passport portfolio. It's a gimme, typically, right? So with passports, there's typically not a lot of time involved in getting them. It's typically not particularly expensive to get them, and so it's a gimme. It's like a chance for you to go through the process, see what it's like, come out the other end with a win. There's not necessarily a strategic value to that first passport. Sometimes there is, but typically it's just all right. This is the first passport you qualify for, and so we're going to go ahead and get that done, and then we're going to execute the strategy from there. Sometimes it can help, right? For example, a lot of our clients are looking for African passports because of how good the generational wealth market is over here, as far as the rules that are set in place to help you build generational wealth. And so if they can get their hands on a Caribbean passport, then they may not need a visa to travel to Africa. A lot of the Caribbean countries like Grenada, Martinique, which other Caribbean passports can I think? St. Lucia. Some of these Caribbean passports, they don't require any visas in Africa, right? So you'll have an African American, maybe their grandmother is, Grenadian, or they're like Malcolm X, and their mother's Grenadian or something like that. And then they can go back, get that Grenadian passport, and then they can travel to most, if not all, of the countries in Africa visa free, right? Which you can't do on an American passport, right? So depending on what your focus is, this next passport can really, really assist you in executing, those plans, right? So that first passport may not be as strategic as the others, but it may still be helpful, right? Then with the passport portfolio clients, we map out the passport path based on what they want their end goal to be, right? So your passport path might be different, for each client. Most clients that are savvy enough to understand the power of a passport portfolio are going to have a family office at some point. They're heading down that road. So because of that, um, probably the most common factor, or the second most common factor in the passport portfolios, is a break off where some member of the family gets a Singaporean passport, right? And that's specifically for the family office. Okay, the the issue with that is, and the reason why it's a break off, is because under Singapore's laws, you can only have one passport if you're going to be Singaporean, right? Now, there are certain countries that are like, we don't recognize dual citizenship. That's a different thing, right? Not recognizing dual citizenship and ordering that people renounce citizenship are two different standards in the passport world. So you can go to, like, for a while there, Germany didn't recognize dual citizenship, right? And so you could be a German dual citizen, but what that actually meant was, while you're in Germany, you're German, and then wherever else you go, you can claim to be whatever else, but you can't get in trouble in Germany and then like try to whip out a U.S. passport and be like, oh no, I'm a dual citizen. Like, they don't care. You're in Germany. You entered with a German passport. You're German. That's the way it used to be. They have updated that, I think, last year, but it used to be that you couldn't do it. But they didn't require renouncement, right? They're just telling you that they don't care, essentially. Like, we just don't care. If you get in trouble here, we're going to treat you as a German, period, right? Um, and so that's kind of one side of the equation, which is kind of the better side, right? That when you're in my house, you follow my rules. When you're outside of my house, we don't care. That's definitely a better situation than like a Tanzania that's requiring you to actually renounce other citizenships in order to get their citizenship, especially in a situation like that where you gain nothing from getting their citizenship, right? Singapore has a similar situation where you need to renounce, but they give you the world as far as tax incentives, as far as generational wealth incentives, investment incentives. Like, you get a lot for giving up, those other citizenships. So it makes it a good deal for families that are focused on generational wealth. But at the same time, that has to be strategic, right? So what ends up happening is, at least with our clients, you have to pick a woman in the family, right? You don't pick men. Why? Because men, it's like Israel. There's active military. There's a compulsive military service, right? So if you're Singaporean, you gotta do, I think it's at least 2 years in their version of the army or whatever, right? Same thing with like the IDF or whatever, right? You're forced to serve if you're a citizen. So if you put a male member of the family up to run the family office from Singapore, then you're going to stop your family office, because as soon as they become a citizen, they're going to have to go directly to the army and serve their 2 years, right? So it slows down your generational wealth, but it's probably not something that you want a member of your family being engaged in anyway, right? So you make sure it's a female member of the family so that they're exempt from the military service. Typically, you invest in their financial education, more. So you typically make sure that they have an accounting degree, that they have an MBA, that they whatever, and of course the family trust pays for all of that. And then you set them up to run that branch of the family. I'm giving you the very high level overview. Typically, what ends up happening is, once you've gotten to this level, you already have money. Someone is already managing your money, right? Because of that, you have leverage with that individual, right? So what typically happens is, let's say it's JP Morgan that's currently handling your money, right? You would make sure that JP Morgan gives that lady in your family an internship, right? And they would have that internship while they were doing, their MBA and their accounting degree and their CPA and all of the things that you want them to do, right? So they would have this high level internship. that you could leverage them into based on the fact that your assets are under management with that firm. And by the time they were done with their internship and they kind of learned the ropes at this high level firm, they would be done with all their degree programs and all of that, and they would be ready to take over the finances of the family and start the first full on family office, and which of course would be in Singapore, right? So that whole process takes time. The Singaporean citizenship takes time. It takes like 10 years, right? So you have within the strategic framework of what you're doing, all of that time lines up. So to get an MBA, to get a CPA, to get, sometimes they get a JD, the whole nine, all of that stuff, and you have this high level internship at, JP Morgan or, wherever. All of that stuff is stacked together, right? So by the time you're done with it, now you're ready to renounce, you're ready to run the family office, you're ready to get all those incredible benefits from Singapore, and then go ahead and set that up. All right. What if a guy married a Singaporean woman? Then you create a new liability for the family. What if she divorces you and takes half of everything? Right. So families that are thinking dynastatically, they don't depend on marriage. Right. So they're not going to create an entire family strategy and hinge it on whether this person you married was the right person or whether they stay with you or not. Right. So the strategy is definitely going to be on based on the passport portfolio, not a marriage. And you'd still have to do military service. So again, you'd slow down the family's wealth building process by having to go and do this military service because you use the man instead of a woman. All right, so you want it to be a woman, want it to be a female member of the family. So you'll notice that a lot of high-level family offices are run by women. That's why, because that family office is based out of Singapore. All right. It's one of the top places, way better than the British Virgin Islands. They did that on purpose. That was their number one competitor. They made sure that their incentives made the British Virgin Islands look like a living hell. Doesn't even make sense to go there anymore if you have the money to have a family office, right? Completely annihilated the competition. So that is the second most common passport in the passport portfolios of our clients, right? The most common passport is typically the Kenyan passport because we do all of our generational wealth trusts for people who don't have no money yet that are trying to get to that level. All of those trusts start with Kenya, right? And so a lot of those folks will get a Kenyan dual citizenship because they'll eventually relocate here because the trust can actually retire them very quickly, right? So a Kenyan generational wealth trust, especially if they're the first beneficiary of it, they can be put in a situation very, very quickly, sometimes immediately, right? Where that trust can actually support them in such a way where they don't have to work anymore, right? Can't really do that in a lot of countries where you just start a trust and it's just started to get going and already you can quit your job and live off of the trust for the rest of your life. That typically is not the way things work, right? However, it is possible in Kenya. So a lot of times that's kind of the first step with a brand new generational wealther, the first passport that they get being that gimme passport, that bloodline passport, because that's the easiest. But that there's no common gimme passport. That depends on where you come from. So the most common passport amongst our clients is Kenyan, and then the next most common is the Singaporean. All right, for those two reasons. What makes the Kenyan better than, say, what is that? What's that supposed to say? Oh, Nevis. Okay, all right, all right. So when you hear about trusts, you hear about like Nevis and Cook Islands and all that. That's a specific type of trust. It's not a generational wealth. That's an asset protection, right? And so those countries have laws that really make them hard to deal with other courts. And so in like some of those jurisdictions, in order for you to even bring a lawsuit, you got to put up like $1 million bond with the state because you're not a citizen. So you're not allowed to use resources of the country without putting up a bond to pay for those resources because you don't pay taxes, right? Which is actually not a bad idea, but I digress. So if you have actual assets that you want protected and you're in a litigious field, like let's say you're a really, really successful doctor and you make, $1 million a year and you have things, right? But you're a doctor. So when surgeries don't go the right way, when diagnoses don't go the right way, like you're in a litigious field, you have this medical malpractice insurance, but there's always a chance that something's going to happen that exceeds the coverage of your insurance. And now you're stuck with it and you don't want to lose everything. In those situations, that's where like those trusts are appropriate because they're expensive. Those countries know what they're doing. They know that they're creating loopholes for people to be able to circumvent, laws and judgments and whatever. So they make it expensive. It's not cheap to do business there. So you need a certain minimum level of, assets to even think about those things. That's not our primary business. That's about 5% of our business is asset protection trust. So we rarely talk about them, right? Our primary business are people who do not have a bunch of money. They are not super wealthy, but they're trying to build wealth for the next generation. So for those purposes, Kenya is way better than Nevis, right? Or Cook Islands or anything like that, because you don't have a bunch of assets, so you don't have to pay the fees that it costs to upkeep those things in Kenya, right? So the other thing about Kenya is that based on the law and the type of trust that we execute here, the law is very clear that every year per beneficiary, right? So if you have, let's just say you have 10 kids and you yourself are a beneficiary, right? You're the first beneficiary. I see you. I'll talk about New Zealand in a minute. So you're the first beneficiary. You have 10 kids. Every year, the first 10 million in local currency is tax exempt to each and every beneficiary. Each and every beneficiary, not the first 10 million in distributions. The first 10 million per beneficiary is tax exempt, right? That's why there's that caveat about people can move here and retire right away because there's no tax implication to their trust. Typically, trusts are like tax neutral vehicles, right? So if you try to go do something with a trust, what ends up happening, especially under the kind of American lexicon, is a trust hits its maximum tax rate really, really fast, an American trust. So if you pass $24,000 through a U.S. trust, you're at the top tax rate of like 37% or something like that. So you're damn near paying 40% on what would be almost like minimum wage in a W-2 situation, right? So trust can make things complicated from a tax perspective domestically, right? This offshore trust would be tax neutral because the distributions coming out of it are tax exempt up to 10 million per beneficiary, right? That's important that it's per beneficiary because there's some strategy that can take place there. Okay, excuse me. So that is one of the reasons why, from a generational wealth building perspective, excuse me, it's outstanding. Now, the other part of that, especially for Americans, is to make sure that the trust remains non-grantor, which is our standard default trust, right? Which is why many of the clients can be the first beneficiary. If you are a grantor trust, all of that changes. So if you're a grantor trust, then there is a ton of reporting requirements that the U.S. government will throw on top of you, even though it's an offshore trust. They will fine you if you do not comply with those reporting requirements, and the fines are astronomical. The fines are so big. I'm surprised they're not unconstitutional. Like I'm surprised it's not like an unreasonable punishment violation or whatever, right? So typically, our clients do not want to be involved in that. So they're typically doing non-grantor trusts. Now, if they already have a grantor system in place, like they're already dealing with that when they come to us, then sometimes they'll say, I don't care, I'm already making the filings. It doesn't cost more to add another trust to the filings that I'm doing every year. So the costs associated and the complexity associated with it being a grantor trust, I already go through. I'm just going to be the trustee of the trust and whatever. Okay, fine. Most of our folks do not want to spend the time doing that. They do not care to change their career to to trustee all of a sudden and actually manage the trust themselves. So they don't get into that. All right. There was a question about New Zealand. Let me go find it. Or if you're here, just ask the question again for me, please. Then if you're not here, I don't have to answer it. So instead of me looking it up and having a conversation with people that, you know, don't care about that question. Hey, Vibes, how are you? Okay, work, business life, relocating there as a health professional seems viable. Oh, so you want to relocate to New Zealand? Yeah, I mean you can do that. We only personally relocate people to Kenya because that's where our law firm is, right? So as a relocation is a legal maneuver, right? So you definitely want to talk to like an immigration attorney in New Zealand. But if you're relocating there as a health professional, you might not even need to talk to the attorney because if that's what you're doing in most countries, including in Kenya, what you're looking at is something called a work permit, right? And that work permit typically, right? There are some countries that are exceptions, like China, but typically a work permit cannot be requested by the person who wants the work permit. Okay, so the work permit has to be requested by the sponsoring employer, and they have to pay everything. And in a lot of countries, it's even illegal for them to like make you pay them back, right? So they can't be like, well, you have to work for us, you know, for X amount of years or pay us back for the permit. Like they, you know, they typically can't legally do that, right? And so if that's the case, they do everything for you, and it's all free to you. You may have to get yourself over there, right? Like you might have to show up and whatever. And I don't know how you would handle the interview process. Some will do electronics, some will make you fly out. So there's some costs in that regard. But typically, a work permit is incredibly cost effective because your employer has to pay it. So anywhere you're thinking about going as a professional like that, if you get the job first, all the complexity of that move is kind of removed from the equation. And then, of course, you know, making sure you negotiate well so that they set up housing for you, at least initially, right? And making that part of your contract like, look, at least find me the first 6 months or the first 3 months until I learn, you know, how to negotiate your housing market, blah, 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 blah. But depending on the level of health professional you're at, you know, like if you're a surgeon or something like that, they'll typically just get you housing. Now, if you're a registered nurse, maybe not so much, but they should be willing to assist you in acquiring an apartment and at least paying like the security deposit in the first month's rent, and then letting you come in after that. So yeah, I mean, if you're just going over there and just living over there, that's just something to either get with the company about or just have a consultation with a New Zealand immigration attorney. We do have an attorney network, so we can find you a New Zealand immigration attorney if need be, but we don't do any work there. And we've actually never done any work there with any of our clients. So I can't be super helpful to you on that. What other? Well, okay. So there's a lot of Caribbean passports. So like any Caribbean passport, there's a lot of Caribbean descent in the United States. Oh, you're absolutely welcome. There's a lot of Caribbean descent in the United States. So a lot of Caribbean passports, since U.S. people are typically our primary clients, especially now with the current administration. The U.S. people are running out of the United States left and right. So Caribbean passports are big because most of them have a bloodline clause. The newest one to get a bloodline clause was Trinidad. That only happened like last year, I believe. So it used to be Trinidadians. There was no bloodline to that passport. There is now. Folks on that side were I don't know if that's a guy or a gal. Oh yeah, bio. So folks on that side talking about like New Zealand and all that, they typically get Vanuatu passports. That's a strategic passport, right? So we typically get them a Vanuatu passport, not necessarily a New Zealand. Most of you have never even heard of the country of Vanuatu. That is by design. They like it that way, and their passport is strategic. And so it just really depends. With that stuff, it's bloodline. So we've done, like, some people have been qualified for Irish passports, right? So they were able to go get Irish citizenship. It just depends. And some of them are like black people. Well, they do the DNA test and then they find that Irish grandfather, and as long as it's close enough, and they don't look it at all, but they can prove it, that person, the lineage and all of that. They can prove it with the DNA test, the whole nine. They can find that person, and one of the grandparents. Typically, when they don't look it, it's on the mother's side, but they can find it, and as long as they can find it, they can start that application. So there's no like, in general, it's Jamaican, or in general, it's Grenadian, or in general, it's not like that. It's just wherever you come from. Yeah, you got to be strategic about it because some passports you have to physically be there the entire time. Some you just have to have a status the entire time. You don't have to physically be there the entire time. And so you can work both of those passports at the same time, right? You can gain a status in the place that only requires a status, and then you can go live in the place that requires you to live there full time. And then at the end of that, get both of those passports at the same time, meeting both requirements. So that's why to have the passport portfolio, you need a portfolio plan that maps out everything that you're supposed to do based on current law, right? That's a risk to your portfolio. Is that halfway through, your path to that passport, the law might change, right? And then it's like, shit, what do I do now? And so typically there is a recourse. Like, typically with the law change, it'll say, all right, people who are already, this close. But a lot of times those recourses extend to people who have made application, right? And then depending on how quickly that legality was drafted, we've been in situations where we've made application because the wording in the law was lazy, and so we made application even though we didn't actually meet the requirements yet, right? So let's say you had to wait 7 years in order to apply, and the law changed at 5 years. But the way they worded the caveat for people who were in the process was lazily worded, like it was a rushed law because there was some other pork attached to the law. Typically, is what's happening, and so it's like anyone who has an application, right, is immune from the change in the law, and they can continue under the old path, right? They didn't say that the application has to be approved. It didn't say that the application had to be valid, right? So if we're 5 years in and not 7 years in, we create the application even knowing that we don't qualify. That then triggers that I have an application, so I'm allowed to continue under the old rule, and then you continue your 7 years under the old rule, right? That's not always the case. That's just things that have happened in the past. Right, so that's your risk. All portfolios have a risk. All portfolios indicate that you're making an investment of some sort. It's just that in this case, you're not investing in currency, you're investing in access, right? The passport portfolios grant you access to capital markets around the world as a citizen, right? So, like, we have folks that have access to Chinese investment funds because they have a Hong Kong passport, right? And since they have a Hong Kong passport since 1998, China has taken Hong Kong back from the British, and they promised them that they would, very slowly be reintegrated into China over 100 years because they were taken from China by the British for 100 years. So 100 years out, we're going to give you 100 years to get it together and get back. But Hong Kong citizens are special citizens of China. So when we get somebody a Hong Kong passport, they have access to China, right? They have access to Chinese funds, and they have access to doing business in China, and have access to being part of Chinese expansion funds and getting those funds to build roads here and there and wherever in Africa and all of that stuff, right? So all that stuff is super strategic. It all depends on like what it is your family is focused on, what it is you're looking to do. Um, you can do it as an individual. It's just a hell of a lot slower, and it's a bad mentality. No individual can beat a family. If you want to be serious about, having being an industry powerhouse, that comes from family, right? The idea of individualism is designed to keep you from being competition to actual dynastic families that are running the industries that you're playing around in. Yeah, if you're serious, it starts with the family constitution. We just happen to be talking about passport portfolios. But if you're serious about doing great things and having influence and being able to, command your industry and all that stuff, there nothing is going to beat a family. That's why none of these retailers have been able to touch Walmart, right? It's a family. It's not one person. They'll talk about Sam Walton all day and all night, but it's a family. Sam Walton didn't have half of the power that his descendants have because they created a family like the Rockefellers, like the Kennedys, like all of those people. Even Bill Gates, he's a junior. Bill Gates Sr. was the number one lawyer in Seattle, the most powerful attorney, in the state, arguably, right? So this is family stuff, you know. So if I had personal care homes in real estate, wait, if I had personal care homes, all right, so that's a business in real estate. So now you own real estate. That's a separate thing. In the U.S., can I put it in Kenya as a business trust? Okay. So you have real estate. It's commercial real estate. It's not your personal domicile. Now the problem with the US is there are different states and the different and okay. So the problem is in the US there are different states and different states have different rules. That's like the biggest problem, right? Is that there's not just one federal law. And so certain states have something called a homestead act, and that homestead act in certain states is more powerful and less powerful than others. In Jersey, for example, if you're in New Jersey, you have no homestead protection, which sucks, right? If you're in Florida, you have incredible homestead protection. But these, you're talking about personal care homes, they're not your primary residence. So these would not have a homestead protection, right? So because of that, typically, and this might change based on your personal whatever, but typically what would happen to these commercial buildings and these kind of business use buildings, would they be put into a domestic LLC first, and then a trust can own the LLC because they don't have homestead protection. If you take your primary residence in a homestead protection state and you put it into an LLC and then put it into a trust, you lose your homestead protection, which is incredible protection, right? Homestead, if it's an incredible homestead protection state, right? So incredible homestead protection would basically say if you were sued, you lost that lawsuit and you were wrong, right? You're found completely liable, you're completely wrong. No one can touch your house anyway, right? Like there's nothing that you can do to allow someone to touch your primary residence, okay? And again, very high level, overview. But there's that. So In those situations where you have that protection, that house can be put directly into the trust with what's called a quitclaim deed. There are other ways to do it. You can use a warranty deed as well. It depends on your state. But then you maintain that protection. Okay. The other ones that are these care homes, they're businesses. So the LLC should own the property. It does not have to be the same LLC that runs the business, right? You can have a holding company that owns the property and that's all it owns. And it has a contract with a management company that manages a care home or rents the space to manage a care home, with on that property, right? And then that company would have insurance, in case somebody fell and broke a leg or something like that. That would come under that company's business insurance, and then of course the holding company would have just its basic insurance on the real estate. Both of those companies would be stripped of equity, and the equity in both of those companies could be in the trust, right? So you could do that. But I would not take a business property and put it directly in the trust. Why? Because if someone does break their leg and the money it takes to make them whole is greater than the money available in the insurance policy, now what do they have access to? All of the money in your trust, because your trust is the owner. So I would not allow the direct owner, to be the trust unless you have a homestead exemption, right? If you have a homestead exemption, then it doesn't matter who the owner is. You can't touch them because of the homestead exemption. If it's a strong homestead exemption, like California's homestead exemption is like medium. It's not strong. It's not particularly weak, but it's not Florida or, I think Texas is actually pretty good as well. So yeah. But these questions really, really depend on your personal situation and what you got set up. Your homestead in Texas. Yeah, I think Texas is pretty strong. I think they're just as strong as Florida. I don't think anybody can touch your primary homestead in Texas. So the homestead, yes, you can throw it directly into a trust. Here's the other thing. The homestead protection kind of negates this situation, but we have a lot of clients from Jersey. I don't know why, but we do. And there is no homestead in Jersey. So they will opt to just put it in the trust, or put it in the LLC and then put the LLC in the trust because they don't have homestead protection. Now, here's what we've seen over the, decade and a half that we've been doing this. There are some judges that are just ego trippers, right? And they don't like that you can plan ahead of them and take their power away, because that's what you do with offshore trusts. You take the local judge's power away, right? Now, with the trust, there's something called seasoning. You cannot be reactive with the trust. All right? We say it all the time. And all the time we get phone calls of people who want to be reactive. If you are reactive with the trust, you will go to jail, right? Or that trust will just be set aside. But depending on what is happening and you're trying to be reactive, you may go to jail, okay? You cannot have something happen to you and then in response to the thing that happens to you, you create a trust and push all your stuff in the trust. Okay, that's a false conveyance. And it can be criminal, right? Depending on how you react, right? Because it could be that you actually stole something, you know what I mean? Depending on what you're reacting to, right? So if you got, a court order to turn something over to somebody and it's now their property by court order and you rush away and deed it into a trust, right? Now you've essentially stolen the thing, and depending on the value of the thing, and if it was worth going to court for, it probably has a value high enough. It might be like grand larceny. It might be grand theft. And then if it moved across state lines, it might be felony larceny or felony, right? So you get the picture, right? So you cannot respond with a trust. And there's something called a seasoning period. The seasoning period is essentially how long you need to have a trust when there are no problems for that trust to be valid, right? So you get a lawsuit, or even if it's not a lawsuit, if you get into a car accident, right? The person says, I'm going to sue you, but they haven't actually filed the lawsuit yet. And you set up a trust and move everything into a trust, that trust is going to be undone. Okay, it's not going to count because it's reactionary. You need to set up the trust before anything has happened and then let it sit there for 2 years. There are certain places that have 5-year seasonings, but we would never put you in a country that had a 5-year seasoning, right? So If you're dealing with a professional who knows what they're doing, your seasoning is going to be 2 years, right? Max. Now, there are certain, especially for Americans, there are certain things, right? Like Medicare, Medicaid, they have a 5 year look back period. So if your parents are getting old, you might be needing to put them in a personal care facility at some point, and they can't afford it, and so they end up qualifying for the program. Medicaid, Medicare, whichever one it is that you qualify for. All right. And they end up qualifying for that one. They have a 5 year look back. So when you say, oh, they don't own anything, they don't own their house, they don't, everything's in the trust. And that trust is seasoned, 2 years of seasoning. There's a special law with them where the seasoning doesn't matter. They have a 5 year look back. So they can look back up to 5 years, and anything that was put in a trust 5 years before you needed their help to put them in personal care or in an old folks home or whatever, they can rip that stuff right out of the trust by law, right? Now, if it's offshore, will that work? Not necessarily, but you're going to be in a sticky situation, with the judges, because they're going to feel like they have the legal right to do it. So now comes the part that started all this. What we see these particular types of judges do. And what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, the physical real estate is in my jurisdiction. This offshore trust is outside of my jurisdiction, and the trustee is not complying. I order you to go and tell the trustee to bring whatever monies back or whatever, assets back, and you do it. You comply with the court order no matter what. Absolutely. But the trust is set up in such a way where the trustee has discretion, and there are certain triggers that will cause the trustee to always say no. So the trustee is flipping the judge the bird. I don't care where you're a judge. You're not a judge here, and I say no. Period. That's the end of it. So you're doing what you're supposed to do. The trust is not responding to you, and nothing is getting to the judge. So now the judge is irritated, and the judge seizes the property that's in the jurisdiction, right? Which may be illegal, probably is. But the way to deal with that illegality is to now come to court and make a motion, but only the owner of the property can make that motion. So what the move seeks to do is it seeks to get the trustee to fly into the jurisdiction to make the motion in court. And then they can compel the trustee while inside their jurisdiction to get what they want, right? So when it comes to real property, it's rare that we tell somebody to put real property directly into their offshore trust, right? It happens, especially if it's homestead protected. Then it happens, because now we're not necessarily concerned about those weird moves that a judge might, because the homestead protection takes care of that in advance. So it does happen, but typically, if it's a property, what we do is we equity strip the property, right? So any bit of value that property has is ripped out, and that value is owned by the trust. And then you can have the property with the $1 million mortgage on it. You can have that. The court can have that, and the mortgage attached to it. You know what I mean? Like at that point, who cares? Now we'll see you in bankruptcy court at that point, right? Because the equity has been stripped out and is safely held offshore. Right, so it again boils down to strategy. It again boils down to, how you position yourself and how you place yourself, and then going from there. But none of this stuff can be reactionary and work. And most of the people who are like, oh, I had a trust, and then they took all the stuff out the trust and it didn't work. If you ask a couple more questions, you'll figure out that their stuff was reactionary. And sometimes people don't realize it does not have to be reactionary to the event. It has to be reactionary to the circumstances. What does that mean? That means that if I ask you to marry me and you say yes, and as a response to the engagement, I create a trust, that's still reactionary. 20 years from now, and when the divorce happens, the trust, they're not going to say, oh, it has 18 years of seasoning. Nope. It was a reaction to the engagement, and therefore it's null and void. So you have to set up your trust now when nothing is happening. All right? Set up your trust now when you are not in trouble. And then move forward and then you will get that protection, right? Much better protection than, putting it in your mom's name. Is a trust better than a prenup? Maybe. It depends on like how you're going to make your money, right? So, for example, we had a family did a family trust, right? So grandpa did the trust. He did it for the grandkids, but the grandkids were already alive, right? So grandpa did the trust. This about 12 years ago. Did the trust, all of that, set up the rules of the trust. And there was actually a point where the family was just a little bit lazy. Grandpa set it up so that the kids could intern at, there was like a dry cleaning business and there was a trash truck business actually that both did very, very well, right? So the trash truck business was doing over $1 million a year. And the dry cleaning business was doing really well as well. And so they would intern at these companies and they gain experience, and the companies were owned by the trust and the blah, 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 blah. And very standard stuff, right? And so it got to the point where there was corporate housing in general, right? This is big too. You can't do like little things that only affect and only benefit you, right? So if you're dealing with like these corporations and stuff that are owned by the trust. So there's corporate housing available to all executives of the company, and it was said in the trust deed that the kids that were interning would intern, but they would have executive privileges, right? While they interned. So one of the kids started his internship, starts working with this company that has this trash depot in Morgantown, Pennsylvania, right? And so he's living really, really nice. He has a company car, he has a company house, but remember, all the other executives of the company have the same thing, right? Okay. So he has a company car, he has a company house. The company cars are leases, so every 2 years he gets a new car. The houses are really, really nice, and he's living this fabulous life. So he's been interning since he was 16 years old, minimum wage as an intern, right? He's been getting minimum wage since he's 16 years old. I think that was like the age that you can start working in Pennsylvania. So he's working. He gets to 18. He's had a company car since 16. So at 16 years old, he gets his driver's license, which is the lowest age you get a driver's license in Pennsylvania. So his first car is like, a Beamer. 2 years later, he has a Bentley. It's like, what's going on with this kid, right? And he lives in this real nice house at 18. So, of course, he's married at 19, right? There's a baby by 20, in divorce court by 21. Right? And she wants half the really nice house, and she wants the Beamer, and she wants the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And so it turns out the house was owned by the company that was owned by the trust. The car is owned by the company that was owned by the trust. He has been making minimum wage since he is 16 years old. He's now 21. All of this pre-engagement, pre-marriage, pre-child. When it all came out in the wash, the judge was like, all right, your child support will be $50 a month. It's based on his income. This is not a special circumstance, because sometimes if you do have a corporate perk, they can say, okay, well, your corporate perk, we're going to treat that as income, right? Especially if they can see that you're using it to circumvent your actual income, right? Because judges and courts aren't stupid. But every executive in the company had the same perk. It wasn't specifically for this person to evade anything. And he didn't create the trust. His grandfather did, right? So this is not something that he premeditated. I'm going to find some way to do X, Y, and Z. That's not what happened. So it legitimately wasn't part of his income. And he was legitimately paid minimum wage up until that point, which was actually an oversight. They could have paid him more. He just didn't care and never asked for it. Right. And it ended up working out in his favor. So now that's actually a rule of the family now moving forward. Everybody gets paid minimum wage moving forward. But that's what happened. They set up the child support based on minimum wage, and there was absolutely no marital property at all. He didn't own a single piece of marital property. I think he had like a PS, 3 or something like that back then, PS2 or something. That was the only marital property, in the entire marriage. So she ended up giving him the child, taking off. The family reported to us later that she found some other man, told that man she'd never been married, never had a child, and did the same thing to him. Had married him, had a child right away, took half his stuff a year later, right? So there are people who they're targeted like that. And so in that regard, absolutely, he didn't need a prenup. The trust protected him from everything, but it was pre-existing. That's the real crux, is it was pre-existing. If it wasn't pre-existing, that probably would not have worked, right? If he had created the trust, if he was the settler of the trust, it probably would not have worked. But because the assets in the trust and the assets in the company were never his to begin with, right? And it was a family, trust. It ended out playing out into his favor. And of course, this is reporting that we're getting from the family, But based on the reports we got, it worked out into their favor. So that's, in that sense, a trust is way more powerful than a prenup, in my opinion. Right now, if you got a whole bunch of stuff going on, because we got a lot of family trusts where the family money is there, and that's fine, but the people have their own money. Well, that's marital property, right? So that it's in order to protect your personal property and your personal money and your personal businesses that are not owned by the trust, then yes, obviously a prenup. Because everyone has a prenup, just so you know. Every single married person has a prenup, just so you know. It's either the state's prenup, and they have a bunch of laws as to what will happen if this union is dissolved, or it's your prenup. But everyone has a prenup. So the people acting like, oh, prenup, you don't trust me, they're just ignorant mentally, right? And they're not looking at the situation in reality. But there are a set of laws that tell you what will happen when the relationship is dissolved. That is a prenup. All right, so there's a standard prenup for everyone, or you can get a custom prenup for yourself. But just in case you missed it, or you don't think legally, everybody has a prenup who is married. So there's that. But yes, if you have a trust and you're not maintaining anything, for yourself, and there's plenty of families that operate that way. All the money goes into the trust. All the money comes from the trust. They're not operating for themselves. Then your trust is going to be more powerful than your prenup. If you have a trust where the trust is the basis of the family power and the family wealth, but then distributions are made, and those distributions are made to individuals, and then those individuals open up their own private companies and own their own private houses and own their own private, cars and all of that stuff, then that might end up being marital property. And so then you probably want to sit down and figure out how that works. But yeah, so they are separate tools. You don't exchange one for the other, but depending on how you're doing it, the trust might be a hell of a lot more powerful. In your trust, you can actually mandate that nothing is marital property, that nothing going into the trust is marital property, especially if you're settling things into the trust. And then typically, every time something is settled into the trust, there'll be some kind of notarized documentation from both parties acknowledging that this is not marital property. We have an agreement that the property that's settled into this trust is non-marital. And typically what happens there is those two people have that family trust, and that family trust is for their children only. And so we get a lot of this, and it's interesting because it's very amicable if a split happens. Number one, clients that have a prenup do not split up in general. We have never had it. So over the time that we've been doing our thing, the clients that have a prenup never divorce. So that's number one, which is a very interesting, situation. Now that's just our experience as a firm. Maybe you have a divorce firm and not a estate planning firm, an immigration firm, and maybe you have a different, perspective. But as a firm, for us, people who have prenups do not get divorced. So that's number one. But now the folks who are coming in and they have the trust, they have the family trust, sometimes they'll split up. But if they had the wherewithal to set that family trust up for their kids, typically the split is amicable, and there's not as much drama, because the next person that you marry, you have to create a new trust for those kids and that person. Like if you want that person taken care of by the trust, it has to be a new trust, because the trust that you created when you were married is locked into only your kids, right? So your kids are completely taken care of, and that's the end of that. And so there's not a whole lot of animosity because there's no deadbeat either way, right? All the stuff that's in that trust is in that trust for those kids, and it can only affect the kids of that marriage. So there's and of that union. So typically in those situations, there's just not a whole lot of animosity. It becomes like, hey, we weren't good for each other type of situation, and so we split. That's what we see the most of, because the kids are definitely his. Because in order to have that type of trust, there's a DNA test at birth. So he's not worried about whether he's paying for someone else's kids. Her new kids cannot be added to the trust. His new kids cannot be added to the trust. So there's none of that, so they got to go create something brand new for whatever new thing they do. So, and I think from what we've seen, that seems to be where most of the feelings of resentment come from. The hard work that I put in before we split is now being used to benefit this other person's whatever, right? Because that's eliminated by the trust, it really does change the dynamic of that separation. So those are the two things that we've seen. The people who have the absolute family trust, we call them, which means it only serves your family. Absolute family trust. They if they split way more amicably, and the people who have prenups do not split. So there's that. Right. So when you're doing the passport portfolio, typically, typically, instantly your kids inherit your passport. So every passport you add to the portfolio disseminates across the family immediately. And you always make sure that you manage those requirements, right? So, like when my son was born, we had to do a birth notification, and then we had to go to all the places that he has passport access to and do that birth notification with those places, right? So that additional passport is there. He actually got his U.S. passport before he got his Kenyan passport, and he was born in Kenya, right? So the U.S. process was actually faster than the Kenyan process, and obviously Kenya had his paperwork before the United States did, right? So every place that you qualify for, you have to, and typically the trust will take care of this if the passport portfolio is part of your trust deed setup. But you have to make those notifications, because you can sometimes lose one, because part of the qualification is that your parent notifies the embassy upon your birth. And there's typically like a year, like if they're not like crazy about it, like, oh, he was born 3 days ago, F you, you're not a citizen. You know what I mean? It's not stressful, but it's one of those kind of F around and find out situations where it's like, look, there's a rule, follow the rule or else. Like that's why like Barack Obama has Kenyan heritage, but he's not eligible for Kenyan citizenship, because a birth notification was never presented to the Kenyan embassy upon his birth. So he lost that passport in his portfolio. I'm sure, being who he is, he could, find a way. But by the letter of it all, he wouldn't be able to do that, because he didn't have a birth notification. So he would have to come through citizenship a different way other than by inheritance, right? And so you have to follow those rules to make sure it's a smooth transition. There normally is some kind of way to come back later and be like, look, we missed that, or we misplaced the notification, or whatever the case happened, and try to figure it out later. But it's more expensive. It takes longer. You're typically under more scrutiny, blah, 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 blah. When you're building out things like this, you do have the time to make up those things, right? Time is only money when you're selling your time for money, right? So when you're used to selling your life for an hourly rate, selling your life by the hour, then time feels that way, and you treat time that way because that's true to you. You literally sell your life by the hour, and eventually you will run out of time. You will die, and and your income will cease, right? These families, they don't live like that for long. Okay. Most of the trusts that are set up, they get set up with a bond ladder. They'll come in with a bond ladder. So from day one, which goes back to the statement earlier on in the live, as far as a lot of people will just set up a trust here and then stop working, never have to work again, right? That comes from bond laddering. So they'll take their savings, they'll buy a bond ladder, right? Or they'll take whatever is at their disposal, they'll buy this bond ladder. that bond ladder will kick out enough money to sustain them over here, typically as long as they own a house. So they'll normally do a package where we'll build them a brand new house, get them brand new land, we'll do all their immigration stuff for them, set up their trust, and it'll be like a trust estate where they live. And then they have that bond money that's coming in every month. If it's a ladder, that means you're getting paid every month. Okay? And that replaces them having to trade their time for money. They're no longer trading their time for money. They now get money while they're sleeping. All right? And then they have to work themselves out of the mentality that comes from selling your life by the hour for money, which is what most people are doing. Okay? Some people are getting to sell their life by the year for money. We call that salary. Right? But the majority of people are selling their life by the hour for money, and that's why their relationship with time is what it is. Okay? So you slowly get out of that mindset. I wish you all to go through that metamorphosis. It was a beautiful thing for myself. I wish you all to experience that. They get out of that metamorphosis. Now there's guaranteed money coming in for them for like the next 10 years or so. They get their mind right. They set up their emergency fund. Then they start investing in other things that have better, reward and gain, but maybe are a bit more risky. And they start diversifying their portfolio. Even with this, the truth of the matter is this nonsense about the 7 streams of income, 6 streams of income, 5 streams of income, every internet guru has a different number. It's all bullshit. Everybody makes their freedom amount the same way with one stream of income. And once that stream of income provides freedom, they diversify to maintain freedom. It's a hedge against losing freedom, right? And so once you're in a position, that's when you say, okay, now I'm going to park some in real estate and get some dividends from that. Now I'm going to put some over here on the stock market. Now, maybe I'll get a little bit fancy and I'll hire somebody who's licensed to deal some derivatives with me, right? Which is extremely advanced. Or options and puts, or I'm going to put more in bonds or whatever the case may be. That's when you get all these different income streams happening, right? Because you're making money in your sleep. That base money has freed you. No matter what happens for the term, you're going to get that money, right? So for us, a lot of it, our target is 10 years, but a lot of our people get 20, right? So for those 20 years, you're guaranteed that coupon rate. That coupon rate is locked in. So you got a set amount of money coming through, every month. So a lot of people are like, well, yeah, but I got debt. Not here, you don't. Remember, they're being relocated. Not here, you don't. Right? So if the job has been given up, you've relocated here. If the debt was holding you back, guess what? Depending on where you come from, there's a reset button called bankruptcy. You know what I mean? We get a lot of people that just start over. And yeah, the debt was holding them back and the whatever, and they get the bond ladder going and they got their trust going and they got everything going, and boom. All right, that's it. Reset button. And they deal with whoever their local, bankruptcy attorney is, who tells them how long they have to wait, because not, you don't want to try this stuff by yourself. You jam yourself up, right? So you got to get with your local attorneys and make sure you're doing everything in the way that's available to you, right? But I can't tell you how many clients just press that reset button and that's it for them. TikTok is challenging me to solve a puzzle to prove I'm here, I guess. Sorry, TikTok. I don't know why TikTok always tries to get me to solve a puzzle. So, plenty of people do that. Because what are you going to do? You're going to sit there in poverty for the rest of your life because there's some debts that you owe? So what? Yeah, sure, you owe them. So what? Is that supposed to ruin your entire life because you owe some debts? How many Chapter 11s have Donald Trump gone through that opened him up to the point where he's now, a president, of arguably what used to be the most powerful country in the world, right? How many bankruptcies? How many corporate bankruptcies? Personal bankruptcies, I don't know if he's been through any, but corporate bankruptcies has he been through? So you're going to let that debt tie you down for the rest of your life and not have nothing and die in poverty because you got some debt? I wish I would. Freedom. Freedom is all that matters, right? There's a system for that, right? You're not just cutting and running from your debt. You're dealing with it, but there's a system for it. Deal with it and move on. That credit don't follow you, once you leave North America. They may share it a little bit in England, depending on what it is. They definitely share it in Canada. So, you know, but that's about it. That's the reach of your credit score at the moment. That might change, but at the moment, that's the reach of your credit score. I don't nobody care about that. You better go out there and get your freedom. Yeah, you better go out there and get your freedom. You know, I remember though. Like I remember. I've been through every socioeconomic phase in the U.S. So I remember it all, from homelessness to top of the world. You know, I was never a millionaire in the U.S. Um, but minus that, from homelessness to making six figures, I've been through all of that in the U.S. And then making six figures, I was still paycheck to paycheck. I was living in Philadelphia, in the Northeast, Welsh in the Boulevard, making six figures a year, paycheck to paycheck. Scared that if I lose a paycheck, I'm not going to have a place to live, making six figures. So, I've definitely been through the gambit of it in the U.S. It's not worth it. Now I'm in a different category. I'll say that. And setting up your family, having your family trusts in place, having all your trusts in place. That's not the last trust you're going to make. That's just the first one. But having all that stuff in place, having guaranteed income with things like bonds coming in, from sources you don't own, right? I could be sued. I can be whatever. They can win all the lawsuits. I'm broke. I might get distributions, but I'm not in charge of those distributions. My trustee can say no at any point in time. It is what it is. My trusts have been there for years. They didn't come up yesterday, right? So, you know, that position that protects your sanity and your freedom is a position I wish for you all to experience someday. Unfortunately, most of you will not. That's just the statistics of it. Most of you will not, and you'll complain every time something bad happens to you that could have been prevented. Just is what it is. It's sad, but that's just the truth of the statistics. But for the 10 to 15% of you who do, welcome to the club. We don't care about time around here because we're not selling our life away by the hour. We make money while we sleep out these parts. So, it's up to you. Make a decision. Live with it. That's all you can do. All right. Any other questions? Passport portfolio. Dynastatic family. Any other questions? It's been an hour today. It's probably around a little after midnight. It's been an hour and 10 minutes. So a little after midnight on East Coast time. Any other questions about passport portfolios? Guess we drifted into dynastatic families, family constitutions, family trust funds. They're all connected, so it makes sense. Anything else on that? Any questions on that? If you're asking a question now, just press enter, throw it in the chat. I'll wait for you to fix it up. If you're about to ask a question, just throw a 1 in the chat. I'll wait for you. What? Yeah, well, should that be a live of its own? I mean, I guess we can talk about family offices a little bit. It is a natural progression. But I guess we did. We talked about Singapore, I think, before you came out. Do you guys need me to talk about family offices? Or were you here when we were talking about the Singapore thing? Nah, it looks like we're good. No one's saying anything about family office. All right, so that looks like it. Looks like no one has any questions left, and if that is the case, I am going to go to the beach. All right, guys, enjoy yourself. Have fun. I will talk to you tomorrow, same time, same place, until we start with switching the format to just a standard show, which will probably be 45 minutes to an hour, maybe even 30 minutes. And we'll just start doing shows, and you'll probably see, you'll probably see me go live on TikTok while I'm recording the show, but I won't answer you. The phone will just be off to the side, and I won't see any comments until afterwards. But you'll probably see more of the show on YouTube. All right, talk to you guys soon. Enjoy yourselves, and I will see you tomorrow, same time, same place.